Hello. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you. I'm so glad to see so many of you here in presence, and we are also welcoming our colleagues and friends online. So this is a hybrid event, and the event is recorded. So this seminar marks the starting again of ReSIA, or the Research Seminar in Islamic Art, after a year. Last year I was on research leave, and I'm really grateful to those of you who inquired and supported the restarting again of this seminar series. And the year before last, in 2023, we celebrated the 20 years of ReSIA. So that began in 2003, and as a seminar mainly for London colleagues and SOAS students, and then it grew to become an international one. And tonight we have an international audience also on screen, as I mentioned. And since 2021, we have a dedicated YouTube channel, so a ReSIA YouTube channel where you can find all the other ones since 2021 that have been recorded. And from the beginning, ReSIA has encouraged new approach to research, but also work in progress, embracing not only historical alongside contemporary topics, but also intellectual history. It often bridged the gap between history of art and artists, makers of art. So it provides a platform for those colleagues as well, for young as well as established researchers. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you one such eminent scholar, Professor Marcus Milwright, who is well known to many of you. But just to say a few words about Marcus, he's Professor of Islamic Art and Archaeology at the University of Victoria, Canada, and currently is British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of York, here in England. His research focuses on the art and archaeology of the Islamic Middle East, labor and craft practices in the urban environment, and cross-cultural contacts in the medieval Mediterranean. He's involved in archaeological and architectural projects in Jordan, Syria, Iran, and Greece, and has created the Crafts of Syria, Crafts of Iraq websites. His books include An Introduction to Islamic Archaeology, 2010, The Dome of the Rock and its Umayyad Mosaic Inscriptions, 2016, Islamic Art and Crafts in Ontology, 2017. It's one every year, Marcus. The Queen of Sheba's Gift, A History of the True Balsam of Matarea, 2021, A Story of Islamic Art, 2023, a co-edited volume with Evantia Babula, Made for the Eye of One Who Sees, Canadian Contribution to the Study of Islamic Art and Archaeology. And he's co-editor of Brill's series, Arts and Archaeology of the Islamic World, which is a new series. And he's currently working on a book for Routledge, 50 Objects for Medieval History. And also monographs dealing with two early Islamic architectural frontispieces from Sana. This is the Quran, yes, the so-called Al-Walid I Quran, which my students will remember from my lectures. So I'm really looking forward to that because it's such a wonderful piece. And also the late 19th and early 20th century metalworking. There will be question and answers at the end of the seminar, which typically for ReSIA can be an engaging time. So I encourage you to raise your hand and intervene. And the audience online, please write your points or questions in the chat, and we will read them aloud at the end. The seminar tonight is entitled Messages from the Past, Temporal Relationships in the Study of Early Islamic Visual Culture. Marcus.
Well, thank you, Anna, for the generous introduction and also for inviting me to take part in this seminar. And this will very much be, sort of research in progress. So I'm looking forward to having your comments, critiques, and corrections, and so on. Also, I should say that I do have a habit of making too many slides, and so it is possible I may kind of jump over some bits if I'm going over time. And I hope that Anna will just raise an eyebrow if things are sort of heading in that direction. So let's start with an image. Now, if you have a chance to go to the Museum of Art in Cairo, you'll be struck, or at least I think you'll be struck as I was, by the range and extraordinary quality of the woodwork that you can find within that collection. And also, of course, if you go to the Museum of Coptic Art, again, you can see that sort of heritage of late antique and early Islamic woodworking. And these are very much the sort of things you might come across, covering Umayyad, Abbasid, Tulunid, Fatimid, and Ayyubid material. So with these sort of things, of course, we can ask all sorts of questions, but you're perhaps less likely to be spending so much time with this. This is in the Museum of Islamic Art. It's on a side wall in one of the major spaces. But it's a very curious object, and I found myself being captivated by it, trying to understand what's actually going on in this image. And as you can see, it doesn't make a great deal of sense in that the two horizontal bars are sort of cut into by the edges of the vertical elements. And the more you look at it, you see that actually it's these lowest, the sections that you can see above and below seem to be the oldest part of this, because you actually have fully formed what we can call beveled style decoration. And that appears to continue on the side sections, as you can see here. But if you have a chance to see them close up, you'll find that the same design has been done with a great deal less assurance in these side sections. And then, of course, you have other decorative elements there as well. They don't align very well with these side sections, such that they've actually been cut in order to fit them in. And then we have this very strange section behind it as well, which doesn't appear to be finished. And also the star shape, the stellate elements within them don't actually align with the pattern on the outside. Now, I'm not in any way putting this piece forward because I think it's a sort of great piece of art. Quite the reverse. I think that what we have here is something which is involves a set of sequences. And this is one of the things I want to get back to. It deals with the sort of central preoccupation of what I'm doing at the moment, which is to think about the process of making, the ways in which training establishes particular ways of doing things, that the looking at objects can allow us to think about these processes of making and interpretation. Now, we have absolutely no idea when this mule was put together, all of these different pieces, but what we can see is the anomalies that occur through that process. Now, we can think about objects also from the point of view of being partially made. And these, of course, are tremendously valuable objects to us because they allow us to get at the processes. We can start to see how a craftsman or a craftsperson or a workshop would go through various stages to make a finished object. And wood, of course, is very important, not just because of its ubiquity in architecture and the making of architectural furniture, but also because in the context of Egypt, which has very little natural wood, it's an expensive, largely imported material. in the case of the Aqsa Mosque here, they made use of cedar as well, which would have had to have been brought to Jerusalem. But in looking at these sorts of things, we do get a sense of the process of making, because here we can see that we're still attached to the world of late antiquity, of drilling down in order to make a deep background before you start modeling the forms. And so that process just hasn't occurred here, and it's been left flat, as you can see. Now, this sort of thing can start to allow us to think about, how something is made. And I would argue that this process of looking and trying to understand these sequences also gets at meaning as well. So it's not simply a technical aspect to look at all these different aspects of craft technique, but it does have an impact on how these objects were made and understood. So here we have another object from the Museum of Islamic Art. I'm just showing you two details. It's the lower and upper section of the same piece. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on this particular example is that, as you can see from the piece from the Aqsa Mosque, that there's a stage where a flat surface has been drawn with a linear design, and then it has been drilled and carved, which you would see in stucco, in stone, even in ivory as well. But crucially, the linear design only gives you a fraction of the information that you need in order to make the sculptural form. And so what you get from that is the fact that there's a level of interpretation by the carver, who then takes that flat surface and starts to make something of it. And we can see that process going on here, because it would originally have been a symmetrical design. You can see it would have carried on just here, but also it is actually two separate pieces which have been joined together. And what we can see is that the same design has actually been interpreted in slightly different ways on these two sides. Look at the treatment of this, and then above it, that you've got a drilled notch at the end. So what you have again is evidence of two people interpreting the brief, which is established by the drawing, in these subtly different ways. So these are things which I want to, sort of examine in a bit more detail. But before we do that, I'm just going to show one more example, not from the Museum of Islamic Art, but from the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, a very different period. And I'm very struck by this object, which it is noted here, that the framing and gilding, probably France, second half of the 19th century. And yet underneath, the description is entirely devoted to the tiles, which are the 15th century element. And yet, when we encounter an object like this, I mean, of course, we see the tiles, but we see it as a complete entity, however, whatever we might feel about the hybrid nature of the aesthetics here. It's not simply that these tiles are framed, but they've also been gilded as well. So we've got processes here going on, in this case, over distinctly different time periods, 15th century and 19th century. I think it also gets at the fact that, we have an idea of objects being finished, that there's some point when they reach a stage that they are complete. And yet, I think in some ways that's a misleading assumption, because in fact, things continue to change. It's only often when they get into the museum that they become ossified, with the exception of maybe things like restorations and so on. Their basic form remains the same, but we see so much evidence of the fact that in architectural settings and also in portable objects, that there is this process of change going on. So what I'm going to try and get at here is what we can learn from this real focus on the temporal nature of ships. And in that respect, it's a somewhat sort of archaeological approach, sort of trying to identify in a way the stratigraphy of these objects, the way in which they've changed over time. And I want to make a kind of distinction between two types of things. One is the changes that go on through the process of making to a point where it reaches some degree of finality, although as you noticed, I've already said that we perhaps shouldn't take that as unproblematic. But the other side of it is the relationships which are developed between objects that are actually of considerable considerably separated in temporal terms by decades or even centuries, and I'll show you examples of millennia as well. What do we get out of thinking about those relationships as they pertain to objects in a pre-modern Islamic context? Now, in doing that, I'm going to actually spend quite a lot of time talking about coins, and I do that with a considerable degree of caution because I am not a numismatist, and it is a very specialized area. But it seems to me that there are things that we can think about in relation to coins which actually have very important kind of art historical implications, and I'm going to get back to those in a moment. But of course, here we're looking at very familiar objects. If one is teaching or learning about Islamic art, you'll come across these sorts of things. And I'm not in any way proposing I'm going to say something radical and new about these, but I think that they do raise some very interesting points, again, about the way we think about prototypes, the way in which we think about the action of past things upon a present, when something is made. So, of course, here we have, the famous 1229 Dioscorides manuscript in the Topkapi Palace Library. And I'm showing you here half of the famous frontispiece where we have the seated figure of the physician. And then, of course, there were, in that double frontispiece, you see people bringing manuscripts to the scholar for authentication. As has been noted by Ava Hoffman and others, this draws upon a late antique tradition of scholar and author portraits. This is the famous 512 Dioscorides made for Juliana Annicia in Constantinople. And of course, there are similarities in the way in which these two things look. The classical derivation of the text itself and the practices of illustration, again, are shown by this classically inspired grapevine that we see in the illustration there. So all of those things are fairly straightforward. But of course, it leaves open the question of, well, what was the prototype for that image? At one level, we've got this prototype of, the late antique scribe. And yet, Hoffman and others would be well aware of the fact that, there's intermediaries between those things, such as, the images of evangelists, as you can see here. And once you look at these, of course, there are immediately somewhat kind of closer visual parallels here. In terms of the shape of the wicker throne, some aspects of the drapery, including that very distinctive inverted Y that you see stood on the abdomen, the textiles covering the abdomen there. So the thing is that, I'm not wanting through this to come up with, this is the one that links them together, but rather to kind of point out a kind of methodological issue, which is, of course, we are missing so many of these links that allow us to actually understand how an image like the Dioscorides was made. And this is going to get me on to thinking about examples where we can actually show the interactions between things of very different periods and perhaps what their you know, these bigger issues that we see there. So just very quickly, I mean, of course, we've also got this issue. Ettinghausen, in Arab painting, brought up these two from the same manuscript, and his idea was that, you know, we essentially have one where the artist is able to work from a model which has this naturalistic tradition, and then when that isn't available, that the painter would just simply revert to this sort of less naturalistic and schematic, symmetrical approach. And of course, you know, there's some validity to this. And yet at the same time, of course, the Dioscorides tradition through late antiquity into medieval period in Greek does encompass this sort of more schematic approach to the making of plant illustrations. And so I think what we can draw from that is, of course, you know, again, it comes back to, you know, are we looking at de novo compositions, or are we looking at things that go through these different prototypes? But again, these are not things I want to, you know, indicate that there are easy solutions for them, and I'm not going to offer those. But in thinking about all of these issues, of course, there's the great shadow of Baxendall's view on influence. And he, in Patterns of Intention, he wrote what perhaps in a kind of modern social media context would be called a rant, you know, about how we understand this particular term. And his central problem was that influence was invoked by art historians as a sort of implicit explanation of cause. And, you know, he argues that this, you know, is simply impossible, you know, that we cannot see objects actually directly influencing things that happen after them. But also, you know, more importantly, he's getting at the point that what we need to think about is the autonomy of the artist, as he says, reaching back in order to find things, this active process of taking things from the past. Now, the thing is that he uses the term artist, and of course that's not ideal in terms of pre-modern Islamic art, because it suggests a degree of autonomy which we should probably locate in a broader framework of patrons, workshops, and so on. But still, I think that the point is an important one. And so we can start to think about, you know, this question of causation. Now, I just put these up because there's also very interesting medieval writing about causality. You know, if we look at Thomas Aquinas on his commentary on the Metaphysics of Aristotle, he actually sort of suggests, you know, there are different types of causality, and he uses, interestingly, the example of a bronze statue. So he was very engaged in this context with a material made thing, and he suggests that you have a material cause, the bronze, the efficient cause, which is the artist who then gives it form, and then the formal cause, the shape or essence of the work, and then the final cause, which is the functions that that object performs. Another philosopher who did concern himself with this was Al-Kindi, and unlike, you know, sort of many of the other sort of Muslim scholars who thought about causality, he doesn't sort of locate it ultimately in Allah, but actually thinks about, again, a sort of version of efficient cause, where he gives the example of a gold coin, and he suggests that the artist or the craftsperson sort of essentially sort of makes the form of coin as a category and then melds that with the material, which is gold. So I think these are kind of interesting ideas that we can sort of take into thinking about objects. So I'm going to move kind of quickly over these sort of things, but Kosa Amra, of course, is a sort of is such a common study that's sort of taken for, you know, this idea of the continuation of classical themes. So it's sometimes been called the last example of classical painting. And now it can be appreciated so well in its newly kind of restored version, with the clarity of the designs and the original vibrancy of the color is much more apparent. But one of the things, of course, when we look at it, is that we can take individual people working, which is broken down into a grid, very much as we see in sort of late antique manuscripts, or indeed, these very particular types of frames here, which scholars like Guidetti have linked to designs like the calendar of 354 that you see at the bottom here, or at least one of the copies that was made of it. Now, of course, one of the interesting things here, I think, is that this is entirely valid to be looking at these links, and yet it sort of has this implication that there's something that these artists are reaching into the past, and yet it seems to me much more likely that they wouldn't have perceived it that way at all. They were simply using the vocabulary that existed all around them at that time, and so I think that we need to do something to get into the mind space of people working at that particular time. And so we see that in the use of particular motifs. So in Kusa Amra, we have this dedicatory inscription, sadly rather damaged, but we can tell it's a dedication because it's held within a type of frame called a tabula ansata, a sort of tablet with handles. This is a very common type of classical and then late antique design. And we can see its continuation here in different Islamic contexts. Here in a graffito from Jebel Hisma, and the upper part is undated, but it does actually talk about a Mawla, a client of Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, the caliph, from 661 to 680. And then we have this lower inscription, which is not in fact dedicatory, but rather declarative, in that it sort of continues the themes that we see in the latter part of the upper inscription. So we've got, again, phasing of sequencing of activities. But I think, again, we can assume that, in this context, that these objects, they are drawing upon a vocabulary such that they're not thinking about, this is something kind of consciously archaic that they're doing, but rather it's contemporary. But of course, that becomes more challenging as we see the continuation of this particular theme of the tabula ansata into later periods. Can we be as confident that a 13th century example, as we see in Busra Citadel, or the sort of 10th, 11th century, or 9th, 10th, 11th century example that was originally in the entrance of the mosque and downtown mosque in Amman, actually are continuing, or are they simply kind of is it some sort of conscious revival of the past? And then here in the 14th century, we've got a reuse and yet no inscription here because it's worn away, and a more typical type of 14th century inscription here in this little mosque in Beit Ras. So we've got these sort of intriguing issues about how are people drawing on past things? Are they simply using the things in their environment? Are they consciously looking into the past? And methodologically, I think this coin, the famous mihrab, and what was called by George Miles in his sort of seminal article on it, the mihrab and anaza coin, his argument was indeed it was the anaza, the spear held by Bilal, and then also that it was a mihrab around it, even though the coin predates the first evidence of a concave mihrab in an architectural setting. But I don't want to deal with that particularly at the moment. I'm more interested in his argument that he made with regard to where the form of the arch came from. Because he looked at coins, he kept his focus in the numismatic realm, and in his article, he published examples of Hellenistic coins that had single arches with deities within them. And of course, if you go to provincial coinage of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century from Syria, you can find numerous examples of these sorts of diastyle or sort of 4 and 6 column structures. But I think the one at the top is kind of a good example, showing this idea of a single arch with, in that case, a taiki located within it. Now, he's comfortable here suggesting that the prototypes of this coin are a great deal in the past from the object itself. And when Luke Treadwell, the interpretation of this coin in a very long and sort of amazingly detailed and interesting article in 2005, he took issue with Miles's interpretation of prototypes. Miles, in justifying looking back to the past, invoked Artikid coinage, which I'm going to come back to, which does indeed have classical themes on it. But he suggests that, it's a very different environment for him. Artikid coins, an imperial coin manufacturer in Damascus. And of course, it's difficult to disagree with the fact that they are very different contexts. And so for Treadwell, he's more interested in the sorts of things which exist in the 6th, 7th centuries. Also, as you can see, this something made in an imperial context. And so, that provides a good sort of idea of where this image came from. Now, again, I'm not trying really to take sides on this. I think there are things to be said for both ways of looking at things. But at the same time, the assumption that the most likely sources are going to be temporally closest to your object is entirely logical. But is it actually the way we should look at things? Because when we go to medieval texts, and here I'm reliant on the work of my colleague Erhan Tamur, who's been doing really interesting work on ancient Iraqi sites and the way they were perceived through time. You find that the ancient was actually still there. It was still very much part of the environment. And he cites the example of a statue, one of these sorts of statues, of which there are many surviving, of King Gudea from the site of Tello. And they're made out of diorite, these very hard, dark stone. And if you go to a source like Tanuki, he actually talks about that there was a statue on one of these sites, and he says it's made out of black stone and it has writing all over the surfaces, including on the back. He is describing one of these statues in the 10th century. So the thing is that what we see from this is the ancient world is very much present here, just as we can infer from Ibn Washir and his studies of hieroglyphic writing. So this engagement with the past is definitely there. And I think it has interesting kind of methodological implications for it. This is a coin which I find particularly interesting. It's in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Its source, as you can see, these are sort of better preserved examples, and they all date from the same period, from 3rd century BC. And we have the goddess Tanit and then a horse design on the other side. And this one is from that same sequence, but more damaged. But the nature of the damage is particularly interesting. And I'll show you where it comes from, because it comes from the fact that it was overstruck in the late 14th century in Egypt under either Barkuk or Forage. And this is the type of coin that was being made. It's not there's not enough of the writing to be able to tell which of those sultans it is. But what we can tell from this is that at some place in the late 14th century, a coin from the 3rd century BC was overstruck with one from the 14th. So we have in this a distinct moment in time where you can tell that these two things have interacted with one another. Now, what we can draw from that, of course, is limited. This is an accident. It wasn't meant to look like this. The coin probably should have been heated more so it was more pliant, and it simply wasn't struck with enough force so that you end up with the part of the design there. So I'm not trying to read into this a lot aesthetically, but rather to suggest that what we have here is this definite moment of interaction. And it's actually not that unusual. Here we've got a coin. This is yes, this is a sestertius of Domitian from the 1st century, restruck in the 17th century. What we can tell from that is that either coins are in circulation over that period of time, or they're being found as hoards, and then they're being taken to the mint. The lack of wear on the image of Tanit would suggest the latter in this case, which again suggests a series of kind of processes. But we have, really interesting textual evidence of, the presence of these coins in sort of more contemporary contexts. So, for instance, there's an interesting account from the 1930s, a scholar who was in Ethiopia. His servant brought to him coins that were actually in circulation, which included 2 Ptolemaic coins and a whole series of Roman emperors. And they were still in circulation in the 1930s in Ethiopia. So can we tell these things are going on in the past as well? There's a fascinating account in the history of Michael Psellos in the 11th century, and he talks about Emperor Theodora, who you can see just here. And he tells us, and sadly the account is very short, but he says that she had a collection of what he calls darics, and that she kept these in metal boxes, and evidently there were things that were special to her. And what he's meaning by daric are these coins. These coins of, Darius, from and Xerxes, here from the 5th, 4th century, the 6th and 5th century BC. We also know that the first statas that were made by Philip of Macedon were called darics because they had the same weight and they were made out of a similar purity of gold. So it's possible that, there are different types of coins that are referred to here. But it's worth thinking about, how did she get these things? There must have been some awareness that she wanted them. So there must have been a market such that, people knew that they could sell coins or sort of get them to the empress. Or at least I can't imagine other ways in which that would have happened. So it suggests that, these things are genuinely circulating in the environment of the time. So what relevance then does this have for Islamic coins? Here we've got, the famous standing caliph coin in gold, and then of course these many variants that exist in local mints, produced in copper. So gold tends to be, sort of much more controlled. It's done in centralized imperial mints, whereas these were done in local mints. There's more autonomy in terms of the designs. But what interested me was that you have examples like the one that you can see at the top, minted in Homs, and we can date them between about 692 or 697. And here we have another example from Homs, and yet this tremendously garbled design. And it's worth looking at. In fact, we can still see the pole and steps. We can still see the lettering here. We've got bits of the standing emperor, but we've got other stuff going on here. And we'll see why when we see an object like this. This is actually from Andalus, and we've got an overstruck follis of Constantine. And what's happened here, and this comes back to this dispute sort of between Miles and Treadwell, is about, sort of the presence of prototypes, because here on the overstruck coin, by turning it round, you can see the profile, which is readily identifiable as a profile of Constantine or Constantius. So we've got actually a early 4th century coin being restruck at the mint in Homs, and the remains of that coin being there. Now, is that a one-off? Is it simply that, that was just an accident? I think not. And we also see other evidence of the circulation of these coins, in this case, actually from East Anglia. This is a coin that was, a drawing I've done of a coin of Athelbert II, a very minor ruler, who goaded Offa of Mercia by putting Rex on top of the coin, and according to the chroniclers, then paid with his head for this. But Offa did not see the humorous side of this. But what's interesting from our point of view is that here he is actually putting the image of Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf on here, which is from a commemorative issue made by Constantine to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of Rome. Is that just an act? It may be, but at the same time, we know that the dynasty that he came from actually did make sort of historical claims about their links to the Caesars, among other things. So there may actually be sort of meaning within this. So I will very briefly mention Artikid coinage because I brought it up earlier on. And here again, we see this interaction between the past and the present. And of course, we're dealing with that area of northern Mesopotamia and Anatolia at exactly the time when we see Dioscorides manuscripts being produced and so on. This is a fascinating coin, which is associated with one of these rulers, Qutb ad-Din Ghazi, who ruled between 1176 and 1184, particularly in Diyarbakir. And on it, we've got his titles, both on the obverse and the reverse. But in the center, we have this upturned head. Now, this is an important issue because we can identify that we've got an image of Constantine there, as I'll come back to. But the particular source of this is worth noting. Now, there's one other Roman emperor who appears before this in this sequence of Artikid coinage. This is where is he? Julian the Apostate, Julian III. And this is the coin. It's not a very inspiring example, sorry. But you can see this is the prototype up at the top. And then also we have copies of classical rulers like Antiochus VII in the other example. But the point to note here is that the prototype for this is not a copper coin, but a gold coin. This is a rare coin. He only ruled for 3 years, and you've got this gold coin. So the thing is that there's some mechanism by which that gold coin has got to the mint so that they can actually make this copy. And we have the same issue when we look at the Constantine image, because it's not a copy of a copper coin, it's a copy of a gold coin, this which is known in several variants from different mints. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because you remember the follis that we looked at, where he's looking horizontally. In all the gold coins, he's looking upwards. And this is suggested to be a reference to his conversion at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge and the seeing of the cross in the sky. Notice also that even on coins of Offa, we see the upward tilted head as well. We seem to have Constantinian references. And then we've got, again, evidence of the continuation of late antique coinage circulating in Anatolia in things like this object from the Mardin hoard. So thinking about these kind of temporal differences, here's another example of this particular coin. If we think about these sort of temporal relationships, we get these really interesting questions about meaning coming through. The fact that they're copying gold coins suggests it is a meaningful action. And also we can link it, and in the interest of time, I won't go through it now, but we could link it with the histories of Constantine, which were actually circulating at the time, because it wasn't Eusebius's account which was dominant in the Arabic tradition, but rather things like the later sort of life of Pope Sylvester, the Donatio of Constantine. These other stories were finding their way into Arabic, and they were suggesting a kind of very different set of stories. Another interesting thing is that we actually have, such as in Ibn al-Azraq, local histories which actually connect the founding of cities to Constantine as well. So, we shouldn't just assume these are sort of accidental antiquarian things. They may have much more going on. Now, what I'm going to do in the last few minutes is I just want to kind of focus, and I will be brief. I just want to focus on this issue of making and these sort of interactions over shorter periods of time. Because I showed the example of that standing caliph overstruck on a Constantinian issue. But here we actually have a different process by which standing caliphs and other early figural coins are overstruck by figural designs. So things after the coin reform in the early part of the 8th century. So you can see that going on here with the caliph being shown. Now, again, the point here is not the aesthetics of these coins, but rather to show the speed with which one coin is replaced by another. In this case, we see it again. Lutzilish has looked at the way in which later Umayyad coins are overstruck very quickly by early Abbasid issues, suggesting a desire to kind of get rid of images and start with new ones. I think the fact that this process goes on has this bigger art historical implication, because if we think about a building like the Dome of the Rock, I think one of the reasons why we have struggled so much to understand what it actually meant at the time it was built is because those meanings were lost so quickly. They were no longer relevant. And so they were simply expunged and then replaced by other meanings within, a course of decades, just as we're seeing on things like this. So if we go to this question of the processes of making, so this is my sort of second part, and again, I will deal with this much more briefly. What we see is that by looking closely at objects, we can look at temporal sequencing within the process of making. So this predates Islam. I mean, this is one of these old Arabic inscriptions. This is the example of a lintel from Haran. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that we can actually tell from looking closely here at the sequence of which these inscriptions are put in, because the Arabic could not be contained here and continues onto the other side of the cross. And the Greek inscription, done by somebody who has more experience kind of working with a script that has its own proportional system, is able to adapt and contract various things, use combined letters, abbreviate, in order to make up for the lack of space that he now has to work with. So there's a technical issue here, but the more broadly, of course, the importance is that it illustrates the relative lack of control of the Arabic script at this time in relation to the Greek. So we infer things from looking at the physical form of things. So I would suggest that we can do similar things with the inscription of the Dome of the Rock, and I've written about this in great detail, so I won't go into it now. But I think the point is that there's compelling evidence here to suggest that the inscription was put in sequentially, that it was not planned all in advance, but rather it was done in parts, particularly on the outer face, which is the first part of it, and then on the first part of the inner face here, before it becomes much more accomplished as it goes round the remainder of the sequence. One of the things that also suggests that, of course, is that the date actually appears halfway round the inscription, which I don't know of any late antique inscription that does that. So that would suggest that the initial intention was simply to put an inscription around the outside, and then they started again on the inside. Now, things, of course, when we look at architectural things, also, this is again to demonstrate this is the first part of the inscription, and you see how the word Allah is actually treated differently, becoming increasingly narrow as you get towards the beginning of the inscription rather than towards the end, indicating that the people doing it were used to working in Greek and actually laid the inscription in backwards. But again, there's more to say about that, and I'll leave that for now. But what I've been thinking about more recently is whether the sequencing that we see in the inscription actually has a relevance to what we see underneath it. And there are problems here because there's been restorations, all sorts of other things that make it kind of rather difficult. And there's Beatrice Saint-Laurent is suggesting, I think in a forthcoming study, some quite radical things about the dating. So I won't go into that in detail now, but what I want to just briefly mention, and I think I'll just go through some slides here. So here we see the kind of relationship between the text. In a mosaic, that would have been done first, and then you would work downwards as you would with a fresco. So it suggests that they would do a section and then work their way down. Is that there's relative simplicity in the early parts of it. And then here we've got this crucial moment on the inside where onto the second face, the southeast face, they shift from using exactly the same inscriptions that they used on the outer face to using these long Quranic phrases. So this occurs just here. So this is the end of stuff that looks like the interface, and then we go into these long Quranic sections. And what we find from looking at this is that we moved to a much more ambitious type of decoration. Look at the amount of jewelry and mother of pearl that suddenly starts appearing here. Notably also from here, and I'm sorry these aren't great illustrations, is we actually see a shift from here, which is probably part of the earlier sequence where you have a regular palm tree, to on the other side, which you can't really see there, the palm tree is suddenly ornamented with mother of pearl here. So again, it suggests a sequencing going on. So my last example is what we see here. Not exactly an Islamic object, but from the Islamic period, from St. Catherine's Monastery, from a lectionary dating to 868. And this just gets at this issue of sequencing, and it'll come back to the Sana Quran pages in a moment. It's a very odd image because if we compare it to this, from Taiba al-Imam from the 5th century, you can see that the pitch of the roof on the aisle is entirely missing on this image. And then also the columns suddenly disappear at the edges here. And you see the same here, you can see the same there as well. The way of understanding this is to do with the process of making this thing, because they're using a subtly different process from what was the kind of standard way of making an architectural image. And it makes sense when you realize that actually they're making a frame, that the first part of the drawing is the imposition of a linear frame to make these rectangular shapes. And then the bits of architecture are actually fitted into them. So this is what I'm talking about with process. That once we realize that we've got something subtly different from just simply an architectural representation. It's using a different vocabulary, and it's breaking down a space in the same way as we see here, which is to use architecture as a frame, or architectural elements as a frame. It's not a representation of a building. And we gain that from thinking about this temporal sequencing. And we can see the same thing here, where architecture is there for the purposes of framing a person. So this kind of takes us to thinking about how looking at the processes of making of the object, the compositional lines that exist prior to the putting in of the detail, actually tell us really important things about what that image actually is. Because there's been a tendency to view this as a representation of a mosque or a type of idealized building, without necessarily taking into account the vocabulary that's being used to make it. And when we see that the composition is essentially broken down in this particular form, which is the same way that we see an ivory frontispiece, and indeed, interestingly, in the 13th century, a composition like this, then I think these things should tell us that sequencing, this sort of temporal relationships, can tell us some very important things. So in wrapping up, I would suggest that coins can tell us very interesting things. This is the wonderful Bornholm amulet, which is actually a coin from Nishapur, which has been covered in runic writing. So very different set of processes. But here we see, you know, an Umayyad coin, you know, being sort of counterstruck in the 11th or early 12th century. So we've got, you know, these really interesting processes, and coins, I think, give us these sort of moments, sort of datable moments of interactions. And I would suggest that they do provide us with some sort of model that we can start to think about other types of artistic interaction. So I should stop there. Right, thank you.
Marcus, I'm just putting the light up. Thank you very much for this complex subject. And you chose to show us an enormous amount of different material and very interesting ones. Lots of coins, as you said, but those are particular, you know, for the points that you were making. It made me think, the beginning of your lecture, it made me think of potentiality that becomes actuality. You were talking about, you know, the artist that has a design, and then what does it make with that design? You know, and it can make different things.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and then it made me think of the role of memory. You know, within this discourse of continuing certain practices or certain designs, etc. Yeah. Also, it made me think of material value. You know, how much does that influence that? We shouldn't talk about influence. You know, in the case of coins in particular, but also in other objects. And also made me think of what ideological or political values one can sort of put into the discussion. And I was particularly interested in your points. I made a parallel with just a random example, the Pisa Griffin. You know, it's this sort of a bronze statue, which in the middle of the square in Pisa, it's actually not to be taken in isolation, but there are lots of other bronzes around there, and the bronzes are from different periods of time, and it's you know, but they're put together, and there is this idea of Pisa being a second Rome. And therefore, this ideological connection with the political connections with Rome and the not only the history, but also the richness, etc. So, yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, Cyril Mango writes about statues, classical statues in Constantinople and the kind of medieval ways that they were seen. And they were seen as very active things. They weren't just sort of art objects sitting there, but, you know, they could have spirits within them.
Theatrical stage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think to see the chat, what do I do now? Gosh. Oh, yes. Here we are. Okay, let me just go. So please, is this the chat?
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So so members of the who are online, please can you write your comments or questions in the chat? So, but we start here on the floor. Please raise your questions or points. Yes.
Something just caught my attention when you said that the Dome of the Rock was built and then it lost its meaning really quickly. What did you mean by that?
Shall we repeat the question?
Oh, yes. So
for the purposes of the...
Yeah. So the question was about, you know, why the Dome of the Rock lost its meaning so quickly. Well, I think that, I mean, that if you read accounts of the Dome of the Rock from the 11th century and onwards, you have all sorts of discussions of what it meant and so on. But the thing is that very little of that can actually be taken back to the building itself. And when you deal with the building just simply as the material evidence, you know, you find it seems to be developing ideas about caliphal authority, about, you know, defining the nature of Allah, you know, in relation particularly to Christianity, things like this. And then, of course, you know, the building itself is a martyrium. It has, you know, certain sort of established meanings. But the thing is that I think what happened is that the precise, well, firstly, I think that it addressed different meanings as it was being built, because the early phase of it seems to come out of the context of the Second Civil War and the Second Fitna, and then it becomes more an engagement with Christianity in this sort of in this latter phase into the mid 690s. But the thing is, I think a lot of those things were simply irrelevant by the time you get to the early 8th century, and so that's why it starts to develop these new kind of connotations around it. That's my view anyway. I mean, other people may see it in different ways.
Yes.
Thank you very much for it's sort of a double-barreled question. It's really interesting to hear the kind of making first perspective. Artists and makers are kind of random sometimes in their approach.
Yeah.
They might just do something crazy with the material, and we might look at that and think, oh, that definitely means that, but maybe the maker was just having an off day or something.
Yeah.
So have you ever found that you misinterpreted, or there's been like layers of discovery when looking into an object, when having that approach? And the second kind of bit of that question was, you know, the inscription where it kind of started as quite squished,
Yes.
and it got wider.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that they were like, oh, I don't know how much space I have, so let me start really like tiny. Do you know, maybe it was the other way around.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So what is your, I can perhaps if I deal with that one first, because that's the reason why that is certainly a plausible way of thinking about it. The problem is that the inscription actually starts just round the corner, which makes no sense at all, because the end of that section has a little decorative marker, and it's stuck right on the corner. So I'm sure the intention was that the other decorative marker would be there instead of half a meter around on the southeast face. So the thing is that as you look at it, you see, I mean, if you imagine that probably a scribe had written out on papyrus the whole inscription very carefully, if you are only a little bit out with your mosaic cubes, over 15.5 meters, you start to lose space quite quickly. And I think that's what happened. And they were starting to kind of contract the ligatures and then increasingly the actual letters themselves to try and make up space. And they simply couldn't do it. And they ended up round the side. And in terms of, this is where Baxendale, I think, is so interesting with the idea of a brief, because he talks about, you know, the Fourth Rail Bridge, for instance, in terms of brief and execution, is that they realized after that that the brief was wrong, you know, because they tried to put too much text on one side. And so you see them spreading out the text and having far fewer letters per meter, you know, sort of as they go around the rest of it, and it becomes really repetitive as well. But going back to your first question, I think there's an absolute danger that you can overinterpret things. So I completely agree with you there. I think that the way you can kind of deal with that is by looking at a lot of examples, because then if something is really aberrant, it becomes clear, but you can see that there's particular ways of doing things. So with the bevel style woodwork, I've been looking at stuff which is from Egypt and from Iraq, and it's really interesting how differently those are done. You know, the way they interpret the three-dimensional forms and the way in which they're carving looks different. And you even see examples, there's a piece in the British Museum from Samarra where the same design has been carved clearly by different hands. And you see again that they've just interpreted some of these kind of challenging shapes in their way that they've obviously been trained to do. Yeah.
Any other question? Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question. How do you link, because you suggested at the beginning of your presentation that what you observed in the object, the different processes, indicates sort of the production of some meaning, and what type of meaning are you talking about? I mean, how would you imagine the meaning here lodging into the material itself? What type of meaning are they?
Yeah,
Or
yeah, I think it's in the sense that there is a in the process of making, there's obviously at some point some type of design or idea, however it was formed, and sometimes there could be something quite nebulous, which then has to be made into actual designs, and then it sort of is interpreted through the materials. I think it's, well, for me, I mean, it's that sort of point where that has to be kind of given a material form through, processes of carving wood or carving stucco or so on. And the thing is, I think that each of those has a certain sort of semantic range to it. And so I think, I mean, when I say meaning, I mean, it's perhaps not in the sense of it connotes, royal authority or something like that, but rather it has an impact on the way in which these things are seen by people, the way in which they understand that process of making. So I don't know if I'm perhaps expressing that particularly well, but the thing is that
it's a difficult question.
Yeah, but in relation to, for instance, the inscriptions of the Dome of the Rock, looking at the process of making indicated that it could not have been, or at least I don't think it could not have been planned in its totality from the beginning. And so that immediately has an impact on meaning, because if it was only meant to be the outer face inscription and that itself was sort of improvised, then the idea that you could take all of that whole inscription and then start talking about what Abdul Malik thought about things is wrong, And the other thing is, of course, that what it means changes over time in that case, because its initial meaning is different from when it becomes two inscriptions, the outer and the inner face, together. So I think that there are ways in which you can there talk tangibly about the finished thing is different in terms of its meaning from what it meant halfway through.
This is easier to do with inscription because by definition it carries a meaning.
Sure.
It's discursive.
Yeah.
But when you have an ornament, how do you relate processes with meaning? Even if you observe different modalities of making, how do you relate this to the production of meaning, or is there even a production of meaning?
Well, but I think
in semantics.
I think it leads us maybe to limit. I think sort of looking for external meaning, sort of in the sense of iconography, I've always been a bit cautious about how much we can do that. Whereas I think that it leads us to think of these things more as material objects which are interacting with people in the world, rather than kind of external meanings. Now, obviously, there are certain contexts in which we could talk about iconography, but I mean, when we're looking at these sort of decorative panels, I think concentrating on the meaning, on the material qualities of them, and that process of making is more productive to think about how people thought about them at the time.
Okay, yes?
Okay, just a short comment. I'm absolutely convinced with what you said about the early cultures and the influence of early cultures on medieval Islam. Just to mention one example about the famous Fatimid, dolls. In Cairo, we found in Fatimid dolls connected in the same context of an Ushepti, Egyptian Ushepti. And I was surprised, and I was thinking, okay, maybe it's the Egyptian context. And when I talked to Israeli colleagues, they found also Ushepti from the pharaonic period in Fatimid context.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting to see all the Fatimids reuse objects from the pharaonic period for probably cult of fertility or black magic or so. So I was particularly interested.
That's a great example. Thank you.
Any other question here? We can, let's have a look. Okay, dear Marcus, thank you for your attentive looking at artifacts and for raising interesting ideas. I'm intrigued by your distant and near past distinction. Could you elaborate on it? And I wonder if the Ilia Philistine might bear a tangible evidence for this distinction, thinking of going back to Jerusalem's Roman name of the Ilia Capitolina, Adriano's time.
Oh yes. So yeah, the mint. I think he's so Avinome is referring to the mint name which appears on these that it uses Ilia, which is obviously a sort of old name. Yeah, I mean I will admit that this is stuff I'm really in the process of thinking about. And so I in some ways, I mean, I'm not sure that there is a distinction between, you know, short term and long term. I mean, there is in sort of practical senses in that somebody could be working on something, you know, sort of, or a team could be working on something within a sort of tangible period of time. But I think that it's really to kind of think about the fact that there's a sort of fluidity, that there's a past which can be tapped into, which is very much around them all the time. I mean, I used the kind of, it's a part of the thinking came out of things like period dramas on TV, where, you know, if it's in the early 19th century, every single object is from the early 19th century, which cannot be how people's houses were. And similarly, I think that, you know, we see the same things. I mean, John Carswell finding, you know, Ming and Yuan period ceramics in Duma in Damascus still in people's houses. You know, there's clearly this kind of relationship. But I think
so there was Avinash Shalem. I think
Avinash, I hope I'm happy to talk to you more about it.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah.
Sorry, I'm going the wrong way around. So another one is Karen Pinto. Thank you for a thought-provoking lecture, Professor Milwright. I will think about the late 19th and 20th century maps differently. My question is, have you run across the depiction of space on coins, by which I mean something that can be of sorts, map copies?
Well, there certainly are Roman coins that have quite ambitious architectural and sort of urban scenes on them, which have something of the quality of maps about them. So perhaps there, but I mean, I can't think of kind of later coins that do that until you get to maybe the 19th century.
Yes.
But but that's a very interesting.
Yes, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, Peter Northover actually wanted to come to the microphone. Can we do that?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Matti?
Yeah, I'm just going to ask him to unmute.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It is good to see you, Marcus, after all these years. I've got three interrelated sort of question stroke comments, sort of just based on personal experience of life. And one was struck me was the completion of objects. And going back to the time I spent in the Royal Engineers and the University Officers Training Corps, building a bridge is an object which goes to completion up to a point. Then you have to maintain it. So my thought is, with some of your objects you're describing, what is continuing development of the object and what is just maintenance? I'll just finish with my other object comments because they sort of interrelate. On circulation of coins, I think there are two circulations. One is of coins and one of his coins of objects meaning something else. And my story comes from my father, who was headmaster of a large grammar school on the Isle of Wight. And back in the day when dinner money was collected in cash, he would not let his secretaries take the money to the bank, all this suitcase of coins or attaché case of coins. He would do it himself, and he went by a different route every time. And he was also numismatically interested, and so he would look through the coins. And this is in the 1950s and 60s. There were coins of George IV and William IV, and occasionally George III. So the first third of the 19th century, but there was never a Victorian silver coin. There were Victorian pennies in circulation, but a silver coin. And my the only Victorian shilling I've ever had was apparently given to me when I was about one and a bit by an old gentleman at the barber's when I was having my first ever haircut. So there is a circulation of coins as coins, and the circulation of coins as objects of importance.
Yeah.
And the last thought is from the Dome of the Rock. I had the great good fortune when I was at the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem in 1990 to spend a morning with a Palestinian engineer in charge of the Dome of the Rock. And the issue at the time was maintenance, because they were having to reclad the dome because it had been done in about 1960 by the Egyptians with gold anodized aluminium, and the climate, the cycle of temperatures in Jerusalem is different from where they'd done it before in Cairo. Basically, it was thermal fatigue and it was popping its rivets. And the conclusion they come to, in fact, was the Dome of the Rock originally was never gold. It was lead, and it had oxidized, and the lead oxide surface of the sun of Jerusalem looked golden. So it was assumed the dome was golden. So there is a whole issue of people just not understanding what they're looking at.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, that's wonderful to. Oh, sorry. So wonderful to hear about that. Rock is such a complicated building, but I mean the point you made about engineering. I mean, I think it's quite clear there are things that do reach a practical level of finality, but I think that as we look at sort of art in the past, I mean, I'm increasingly thinking that we should be less sure about things reaching finality, that actually they are undergoing changes. And it sort of reminds me of, there was an essay I think by Harold Rosenberg where he was talking about what's his name? Arshil Gorky's self-portrait with his mother. And he argues that the characteristic feature of the modern artwork is that it's never finished, that it's always at a provisional state. But yeah, I mean, I loved your point about coins as well. And I remember, when I was growing up, certainly, I mean, there were, Edward VII coins occasionally were kind of, but you'd find them in your change and things like that. Not so much now, I think, but yeah. Anyway, thank you.
And then Karen Pinto again, regarding Qusayr Amra, I have reinterpreted the angel bringing the wraith as an angel carrying a painting of the moon.
Oh, yes.
Perhaps qualifying it as the earliest artistic rendition of details on the moon. Would that suggest a variation on the late antique norm? My article on the moon image at Qusayr Amra is available through my academic page.
Indeed, and I have read it. It's very interesting. Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. I mean, it's I mean the Qusayr Amra is always so challenging because the images are still so fragmentary, and so we always have to be wondering about which bits we're not seeing. But I think yes, I mean it's certainly a possibility. But thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions here? Oh, comment? No? Well, thank you, Marcus. You gave us a lot to think about. And thank you again.